Didn't I tell you the truth about her? Yes, I did. Now, you ready for some more talking? Yes. Well, our next teller, is Laura Packer. And she was here a couple of summers ago for our Texas conference. How many of you came to the conference? Well, those of you who didn't, you really missed it. People enjoyed her so much, they said, we want more of her. So this is her first time to the Texas Festival. Now, Laura says, she believes in kindness. And she also believes that listening, we've got our listening ears open, right? That listening to each other can change the world. So let's welcome to the stage Laura Packer. How are we going to do it? Come on. Talk, talk, talk that talk. Come on. Talk, talk, talk that talk. Talk, talk, talk that talk. Here's Laura.
That's perfect. Thank you. So before I start, I just want to give a shout out to Tony for doing such a great job welcoming us all here. Thank you, Tony. This is a Sufi story. In the beginning, God made everything. God made the trees and the rain. God made the rocks and the sky and the waters and the mountains and the mice and giraffes and everything. And when time came to make human beings, God spent a long time crafting our bodies with our long limbs and our solid cores and our great faces and hair and everything. And then God made the souls out of the memories of clouds, out of the light shining through that grape jelly, out of everything that ever could be. And then God said to the souls, there you go. That's where you're going to live. The souls looked at the bodies. And yeah, they were pretty, but they did some unfortunate things. And then one of the bodies let out a long, ripe belch. The souls looked at the bodies and said, we are not getting in those things. And God said, okay, and went down to the bodies and whispered breezes into their ears, and then leaned down and brushed their lips. And all of a sudden, the bodies started swaying back and forth and clapping their hands. And as they clapped, all of the bodies began to swirl and whirl and dance. And these sounds began to come out of their mouths. They began to sing, and they sang and danced until they were so tired they just had to sit down. And when they sat down, they started to talk. And they talked back and forth and back and forth, and they told each other all of the stories that were first born into the world. The souls looked at what was going on, and they said, that looks great. Why can't we do that? And God just kind of shrugged. We want to be able to do that. And God just kind of shrugged and gestured a little bit. And the souls, with a great sighing sound, slipped into the bodies and have stayed there ever since. And that is why, from that day to this, it is music and dance and story that keep body and soul together. Thank you. Now, once upon a time, there was a farmer. And because this is a fairy tale, he was a poor man, but a good one. He lived out at the edge of the town with his daughter, and he did his best to get by, but really, this isn't a story about him. It's a story about her. Now, every morning on her birthday, every year on her birthday, her father would come in and he would wake her up and he would say, "Happy birthday, sweetheart. You are smart, you are funny, you are kind, you are so good at solving problems. I love you so much. I am so proud that you're my daughter." And every year on her birthday, the girl would be grateful for her father telling her she was smart and funny and kind and good at solving problems, but more than anything else, she yearned for him to say that she was beautiful. He never did. And he never did because, truthfully, she was not beautiful. At best, she was plain, All right, I'll be honest, she was homely. And so more than anything else, she yearned to be told that she was beautiful, and it never came. So it was on the morning of her 18th birthday, her father came in and he woke her up. He said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart. You are smart, you are funny, you're kind, you're good at solving problems. I am so proud that you're my daughter. I love you so much." And she was grateful to hear these kind things from her father, and yet she felt that twinge. Then he lit up and said, "Come with me, I have a gift for you." "Father, a gift? We can't afford a gift." "Shush," she said, "just shush, come with me, come with me." And so she followed him down the stairs, across the hall, out the door, across the yard, around the corner, into the barn. And there in the barn was a mule. The girl looked at the mule looked at her. Thanks, but Father, a mule? "A mule is a great gift," he said. "I mean, think about it. You can ride the mule, you can carry things with the mule. You are so smart that I know you're not going to stay in this little town forever. I know you'll come up with something great to do with the mule." "All right, Dad, thanks." Well, they had a lovely day. They talked and they laughed and they did their chores together and they lived their lives. That night, while she was lying in bed, staring at the same cracks in the ceiling she'd seen every day of her whole life, she began to think. Remember, I told you this girl was smart. She had been around the fairy tale block a few times. And so she thought to herself, a mule. A mule. Of course, the mule is enchanted. So she got up, put on her robe, went downstairs, across the hall, out the door, across the yard, around the corner, into the barn. Then she looked at the mule. And the mule looked at her, and no one was there. Nothing happened. So she shrugged and went back upstairs and went back to bed. And the next morning, as she was eating breakfast, her father said to her, "Sweetheart, would you mind taking the wood that I've gathered into town and selling it?" Now, to tell you the truth, she hated going into town. She hated going into town because whenever she did, all the pretty girls, they'd look at her and they'd go, The boys, they would throw stones at her and they'd say, "Ugly, ugly, ugly." She hated going into town, but as much as she hated going into town, she loved her father more. So she said, "Of course, Father, I'd be glad to." And then he said, "You can take the mule. You can tie the wood to the mule. You can ride the mule. See, I told you it was a great gift." "Fine," she said. Well, she went out to the barn. She tied the wood onto the mule, and then she hopped up onto the mule. Now, she didn't know it, but the mule was enchanted. As soon as she hopped up on that mule, she was no longer ugly. Now she was beautiful. She rode the mule into town, and everyone just stared as she went by. The boys ran up to her with bouquets of flowers, begging her to take theirs. She thought everyone was making fun of her in a new way, so she ignored them all, rode the mule around the corner of the little shack where she and her father sold things. She hopped down off the mule again and became her own plain self. She spent the day selling the wood, and at the end of the day, she hopped back up onto the mule and rode out, and as she did, everyone stared. Well, she went home. She put the mule back in the barn. She and her father had dinner, and she went to bed. But what she did not know was this. Not long after she rode out of town, the prince came to visit. I realize this seems like a very big coincidence. This is a fairy tale. Things like that happen in fairy tales. And so the prince came to visit because he wanted to know how everyone was doing. He wanted to hear the gossip and the news, and all anyone was talking about was the beautiful woman who rode the mule. And of course, the handsome prince on his beautiful white horse, he was intrigued. He asked, and everyone said, "Well, we don't know who she is, but she rode off that way, down where the farmer with the ugly daughter lives." So the next morning, the prince rode his beautiful white horse down that road. He came to the house. He knocked on the door. The girl opened up the door, and she looked up at the handsome prince on his beautiful white horse, and he looked down at a girl who was certainly not beautiful. "Excuse me," said the prince. "Is there a beautiful girl who rides a mule who lives here?" "No." "Do you maybe have a beautiful friend?" "No." A beautiful cousin, perhaps, or a sister?" "No," she said, but remember, she was smart. "I do have a beautiful neighbor, and if you come back here tomorrow morning, she will be here with her mule to greet you." And the prince, satisfied, turned and rode off. Now the girl thought, she knew she was the only one who rode the mule. There had to be something strange going on. She went up to her room, she picked up her hand mirror, and she looked at herself. There she was, the same plain face she'd seen every day of her life. She took that mirror, she ran downstairs, across the hall, out the door, across the yard, around the corner, into the barn, and she hopped up onto the mule, and she looked at herself again. She was beautiful. The mule was enchanted. So the next morning, she got up bright and early. She brushed her teeth, she brushed her hair, she washed her face, she put on her best dress. She went out to the barn, she hopped up on the mule and rode to the front of the house, just as the handsome prince on his beautiful white horse rode up to meet her, his face lit up. They rode through the village, talking back and forth, and as they rode, everyone just stared as they went by, because they'd never seen such a beautiful couple before. At the end of the day, he asked if he could come calling again. She agreed. The next morning, they rode out through the forests, and as they rode through the forest, they talked back and forth, and she could make him laugh like no one else ever had before. At the end of the day, he asked if he could come calling again, and the next morning, they rode out amongst the fields, and as they rode, they talked back and forth. He told her what it was like being a prince and how problematic that could be. She listened and came up with some really good ideas to solve his problems. By the end of the day, he could help himself no more. "Not only are you the most beautiful woman I have ever met, but you are smart, you are funny, you're kind, you're good at solving problems. I have fallen in love with you. Please, will you marry me?" Now this girl, she had a thought or two in her head, so she said, "Yes, I will, but on one condition. I want you to remember me, to think of me always as I was in that first moment when we met. So I will spend time with you only when I am on my mule and you are on your horse." The prince was so besotted that he agreed. They went back to the house, they got her father's permission, and the next day off they rode. They rode through villages and towns until finally they came to the capital city. They rode through the city, they rode up the stairs of the church. They rode down to the altar, and there in front of the altar, he on his horse, she on her mule, they spoke their vows to one another. They rode back out the aisle of the church, down the steps, across the square, up the steps of the palace. They rode into the great hall, and there they had their wedding feast. Everyone was delighted to see the prince so happy and so well matched in beauty and in wit. I know some of you are wondering about this. Towards the end of the meal, she leaned over and said, "Husband, this is all rather new to me, so if you don't mind, I would like to retire to our bedchamber first, and you can join me a few minutes later." Her husband readily agreed, so she made her farewells. She rode out of the great hall. She rode up the stairs in the palace. She rode down the long hallway until she came to the door of her bridal chamber. She looked around. No one was there. She hopped down off her mule, ducked into the room, closed the curtains, blew out the candles. The prince joined her soon. They had a lovely night. And in fact, they had a lovely marriage. Every morning she would rise early, go down and mount her mule, and the prince would come join her, he on his horse, and they would ride through the kingdom, and life was good. Well, one morning, not so long after they were married, but not so close that it seemed like marriage was still new, she found herself in the rose gardens. She loved roses more than almost anything else. She rode on her mule amongst the rose plants and admired their beauty. and their fragrance, when she spied to one side a little bush of tea roses. Now, if you don't know, tea roses are very small and very fragrant, and they never grow to be very high, so she leaned down to try and pick some. But there atop her mule she couldn't reach, so she hopped down. She picked some of the roses, she held them to her, and she was so entranced by the aroma that she didn't hear her husband's horse riding up behind her. Now the prince rode into the garden, and there was his wife's mule, and there was a woman wearing his wife's dress, but she didn't look anything like his wife. "Who are you? What are you doing there? What's happened to my wife?" The woman's eyes snapped open. She saw the prince, and she thought quickly, and she said, your wife, she's over there," pointing behind the prince. The prince turned to look, and while his back was turned, she hopped right back up onto her mule. When he looked back, there was his beautiful wife, wearing the same dress that the other woman had been wearing, clutching those same flowers. "Wait a minute. Wait just a doggone minute. Was that you just a minute ago down there on the ground, only you looked, different?" She began to cry. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to lie, but you fell in love with me when I was beautiful, and I was afraid you wouldn't love me when you found out I wasn't. I'm so sorry." She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Now, she was so busy crying that she did not see the smile that began to spread across the prince's face. "Finally," he said, "I can get off this doggone horse." He hopped down off his horse, and he was no longer a handsome prince anymore. At best, he was plain. If truth be told, he was really quite homely. She leapt down next to him, and they embraced, and they lived happily and honestly, if not beautifully, ever after.
Come on, you can do better than that. Give her a big hand. Isn't she beautiful? And she doesn't have a mule either.